Present today, we have Kathy Moore, Kristen Swetland, Tommy Minton, David Pollock, Curtis Gashlin, and absent, we have Darrell Lopez and Lawrence Wright.
Okay, thank you. The first item on the agenda is approval of the minutes from the September 4th, 2018 meeting. Do we have a motion to approve?
My motion to approve.
Mr. Minton, thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Mr. Pollock, is there any discussion? Seeing none, we'll call the vote. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Next item on the agenda is the presentation of regarding the transportation, and that's been postponed until October 2nd. Next is public comment. This is time for anyone wishing to speak to the board to come forward at this time. Seeing none, we'll close public comment. We have no public meeting items. Our next item is a public hearing on ordinance number 1677, amendments to the Land Development Code, Articles 3, 4, 5, 6, 13, 14, and 18. Can we hear from staff?
Yes, ma'am. Good evening, Madam Chair, board members. This request is to adopt amendments to the city's land development code relative to Article 3, dealing with development agreements, Article 4, zoning districts and regulations, Article 5, supplemental regulations, Article 6, the downtown mixed-use districts, Article 13, parking, 14, signs, and Article 18, basic definitions. The purpose of the code changes are to clarify requirements relative to special events, non-statutory subdivisions, introducing antiquated subdivisions, lot aggregation and lot reconfigurations, residential zoning districts, boat docks, alcoholic beverages, animal services, exempt signs, and parking standards, and establish new standards for personal mini storage warehousing, artisan food production companies or businesses, as well as microbreweries, micro distilleries, and micro wineries, and to update their associated tables of permissible uses and prohibited uses, as well as the minimum lot regulations and basic definitions for internal consistency. Sections 2.4D and 2.4E of the Land Development Code require the local planning agency to review these amendments, to conduct a public hearing, and make a recommendation to City Council. City Council has final approval authority per Section 2.5 of the Code. The Florida Statute Section 166.041 requires that the local governing body, which is the City Council, hold 2 advertised public hearings on the proposed ordinance. Therefore, this ordinance number 1677 will undergo 3 public hearings because the city's regulations require a public hearing at the LPA as well. And this is the first of those 3 hearings. Over the past several years, there have been some issues and questions arising as a result of the vagueness of the code, of some sections of the code the way they're written now. The details of the code changes are in the ordinance, and this presentation will go over the key changes that are most impactful. The bulk of the rest is editorial and cross-referencing. So as I mentioned, we'll cover these articles. In Article 3, Development Agreements, Section 3.5 is going to be changing the special event permits requirements to exempt city-organized programs and activities from the requirement of undergoing a special event permit. We also have changes to Section 3.5C in Article 3, which speaks to the non-statutory subdivisions or lot splits. Currently, properties that are currently platted cannot undergo a lot split. They have to replat. Some of those lots are non-conforming as to their size. They're not conducive to development based on what we would expect a new subdivision to go through. So staff is introducing an antiquated subdivision, and the date for that is where we are selecting the date of 1971 March 1971, which is when the city adopted its subdivision regulations. So we're classifying those subdivisions that were adopted or that were platted prior to the city's regulations to be antiquated subdivisions, so that those lots wouldn't have to go through a replat just so that they can develop. The purpose there is to help promote redevelopment of those antiquated lots. Similarly, in Section 3.5D, for reconfiguring or aggregating lots, we're introducing the antiquated subdivision provisions to, again, promote more redevelopment and efficient use of those older lots. In Article 4, the zoning districts and regulations article, I broke the presentation out into changes and cleanups and new land use categories. The first thing that we noticed is when we were looking through, when we were going through the code to update things, is that there isn't an assignment of the R1B and R1BB in the way that the code is written now. So based on this, we have a minimum lot size table that lists all the zoning districts in Table 4.1, but we didn't have those two zoning districts listed in the corresponding descriptions. So we modified the descriptions to include those two missing zoning districts that are existing. And also we noticed when we were doing that the titles for the zoning descriptions were based on the residential typology, whether it's single family, multifamily, duplex, and so whatnot, instead of by zoning categories. So at the suggestion of the city manager, we just changed the titles of those descriptions to be based on by zoning districts. All of these changes are consistent with the density standards set forth in the comp plan. We also modified the types of senior housing based on updates and changes in state legislation and state laws, and some definitions that were put forth by some of the regulatory agencies. So the adult congregate care facility became adult family care home, and assisted care living facility becomes assisted living facility. The definitions and their functions remain essentially the same. Statutes also created a community residential home, and in that statute, Section 419, it actually specifically spells out if it's 6 units or less, then it's residential. If it's 7 units or more, then it's commercial. So we have a section for community residential home residential and a community residential home commercial. And we applied those into the table 4.1, and then you'll see later in the corresponding tables in table 6.4 and 6.9. We also, in terms of personal storage and mini warehouse uses, those are currently allowed in C2 as a special exception. After analyzing some of the personal storage warehouses in the area, their impacts would be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. Typically, the traffic impacts aren't as high, so staff felt that it would be good to allow that use in office commercial and C1 also through a special exception. So any new one that comes in will still have to go through a special exception and get approval through a public hearing at City Council. The last change that we made for cleanup and clarification was the distinction for animal services. The way the code is written now, there are 3 sections in the table: animal services with a superscript of 3, veterinary without a kennel, veterinary with a kennel, and then kennel all by itself. There wasn't one for pet care services such as dog grooming, those kinds of places. The superscript 3 prohibits dog grooming or any type of animal services in any shopping centers. We have situations where there are those types of services or those types of uses in shopping centers now. They would become non-conforming. So this is an attempt to allow those types of uses because the intent of having the prohibition was to prevent kennels from going to those locations that are closer to shopping, closer to retail, and closer to residential. So we took out the superscript and then created pet care services and separated non-medical pet care services that do not include kenneling, and then those more intensive pet care or animal care services that do include kenneling. The kenneling requirements stay the same. The pet care services is a little bit more, what's the word? Convenient, more available, more options for people to locate in a C2 in a shopping center or something like that. So those are all of the cleanups for Table 4.1. The new additions to Table 4.1 is to put in place the language for microbreweries, micro wineries, and micro distilleries, which became which were declared zoning in progress by City Council in March of this year. And as we were reviewing the code to incorporate those uses, it made sense to also include artisan food production, which are those like confectionaries, cheese production, like traditional ways of making bread on a small scale. So we put those uses in the same zoning districts that we would be putting the microbreweries or the micro uses as guided by Council's zoning in progress. With these changes in the various zoning districts, the changes to the zoning districts for single-family attached, and when we looked at the residential zoning districts, we also noticed that there wasn't a spot where we could put single-family attached. Right now, it has single-family duplex, and multifamily, but there wasn't a spot for single-family attached. But so we looked at the existing zoning categories and based on their square footages, matched those square footages to the density standards in the comp plan and identified those zoning districts that where single-family townhomes could be located. The lot sizes of those, we changed the table to just defer the lot sizes, like dimensions and minimum lot width, to the architectural standards in Article 8, which currently has minimum standards for a 20-foot lot width, and I believe it's 1,800 square foot of minimum lot size. So we just added that use to allow people, to give people the opportunity to build single-family homes, attached townhomes, as another method of medium-density residential. Let's see. The other thing that we added to Table 4.1, the way the table is now, there's confusion for zoning districts like R2. In the land use table, it says single-family and duplex, but when people see that, they automatically assume that if I have an R2 lot, I can put in a duplex. But that sometimes the lots are of a size that doesn't meet density. So people are caught by surprise when we tell them, well, you can't put a duplex here because you're not meeting density. If the lot isn't of sufficient size, you calculate the square footage or the acreage by the max of 8 units per acre. They can only build one single-family unit. So we added a note to the very top of the description of Table 4.1, 6.4, and 6.9 that these uses are allowed. However, densities and intensities are established in the comprehensive plan. For Article 5, this is dealing with, this was when staff was incorporating the micro businesses into the code. We looked at doing it in Article 5, Section 5.6. If you're following along on the staff report, if you could just set that to the side and look at the handout that looks like this. So in the process of trying to incorporate the microbreweries, distilleries, and wineries into the code, we were trying to figure out which classification to put them in. And as we were doing that, we realized that there are some changes that needed to be made to the existing code, because the way it's written now, it says that that a person would apply for a business license and the city would issue a certificate. the reality of it is that the city does not issue any alcoholic licensing or certificates. That is a function of the state. So we changed all the references to certificates to classifications, and then we added this table to remove any links to the licensing types that are issued by the state, to just where we want these uses and what classes we want to put them in, and then we would regulate where those classes could be located by zoning district. So what you see on page 1 of this handout under 5.6 C is that we are maintaining the 5 classes that are currently there. We are separating or splitting class 3 into an A. A covers what's currently there, and B covers the micro establishments. And so basically going across the board, the city classification, alcohol type, whether it's beer, wine, liquor, distribution type, whether it's by package for off-premises consumption or by drink for on-premises consumption. So what you see in this table is exactly how the code reads now, just in tabular form, with the change that Class 3 has been split to Class 3A for existing, what the city currently has, and Class 3B for the wineries, the microbrewery, winery, and distillery. And the intent there is to allow on-premise consumption by the drink, and to allow people to purchase those local brews or local products to take home with them. And we chose to do it this way because the state has several pages, front and back, of all the different types of classifications, licenses, and it becomes a daunting task for the city to try to make sure we include all the appropriate ones, since it didn't really make a lot of sense for us to keep doing that, since we are not the body that issues those certificates and licenses anyway. The remainder of Section 5.6 of Article 5 remains the same. For incidental uses, we did spell out that Class 3 would allow those micro establishments, and we listed the uses that they couldn't be. I'm sorry. The Class 3 would also be allowing wine and beer for on-premise consumption if it's incidental to something else, like a recreational use, a sporting use, entertainment or amusement use, personal services such as massage parlors and cosmetology services, and limited retail, including restaurants, as determined by the land use administrator. So it's kind of a case-by-case basis. The problem, the situation that we have now is that the way the code reads, it's 45 seats. So some businesses or some restaurants may only have 30 seats or 35 seats, and they still would not be allowed to serve wine and beer the way the code's written now. So this is to give them more opportunity, or give more businesses an opportunity to serve wine and beer if it's a restaurant, period, regardless of the specific size. We kept the 45-seat minimum for Class 4, Class 5. Those are the more intensive alcoholic beverages establishments. And Class 5 still requires approval by City Council. So that's the handout. And then, just to stay on this slide for a second, we just made the associated changes in the prohibitions. Right now in Section 4.11, it just says alcoholic beverages are not allowed unless they're incidental to restaurants. We specifically called out Class 4 and Class 5 in that section, and we added bars and cocktail lounge definition into Article 8. And that definition specifically says that microbreweries, wineries, and distilleries are not considered bars and cocktail lounges, because those are the more standalone bars where that's their main thing, is to serve beer, wine, and alcohol, period, regardless of the scale. So all the changes relative to the various zoning districts and land uses in Table 4.1, we applied the same as appropriate to tables 6.4 and 6.9 of Article 6. So basically, the changes that we made to senior housing got moved here as well, got incorporated here as well, and also for pet care services, those got moved into here as well. Same thing for the zoning categories for the micro establishments and artisan food production establishments. So with the changes to the zoning categories, the microbreweries and whatnot, when we were looking at that, we felt the need to, we had to create parking standards for the new categories, the brand new ones, the micro wineries, breweries, and distilleries, and the artisan food. But in the course of looking at standards for those, we realized that warehouse, for example, is an existing use that doesn't have a parking standard. So we did some research to apply a standard for that. And the same thing for assisted living facilities. That's an existing use, but there wasn't a corresponding parking standard for that, as well as scrap materials, junkyards, and graveyards, or auto graveyards. So there are some standards that we use for that. In Article 14 for signs, the only change there is to add to the exemptions that signs which are commemorative plaques, and we have a new definition in the basic definitions article, number 18, to say that commemorative plaques are exempt signs, meaning that they wouldn't have to come in to pull a permit. And these are things like for historic markers or trail markers, anything that would provide information to the general public about a historic figure or historic place or historic event, something like that, or maybe a trail, so that those signs wouldn't have to be permitted. And then the last change is to Article 18 for basic definitions. So we have a total of about 9 new definitions, and 5 modifications and 2 deletions. So with the deletions, as we were going through the research on the different types of senior housing facility, the revisions to the new adult family home care, the assisted living facility, the new commercial community residential home residential, community residential home commercial, the independent living facility types, those pretty much covered all the different needs of our senior and elderly population. So we removed group home and nursing home since we don't have any in existence, and we would not be impacting anyone by removing these. It's just removing some of the definitions from the code. For the modifications, we went over that. The convenience store modification, it actually had a specific square footage in there. That's more of a standard, so we took it out of a definition. The standards are in the code, the zoning code. For accessory structure, the change there is that it had a word customarily. Yes. So we struck the word customarily accessory, because accessory is accessory, whether there's no customarily or whatever, it's just accessory. For boat docks, right now we have a definition of a boat dock only, and the change to the boat dock definition is that we called out the different components, like there's a boat house, a boat terminal. The code requires a boat dock to be a maximum 600 square feet, and 250 for a boat house, 250 for the terminal, and the balance is on like the pier or what have you. We also changed the boat dock definition to say that someone could not, to reinforce actually the roof pitch of a boat dock, so that someone could not build a deck on the second floor and have, a entertainment space on the deck of a boat dock. Correspondingly, in the new definitions, we have, a boat house definition, and where we require that the boat house is a component of the boat dock, and then a boat terminal, again, as a component of the boat dock itself. I mentioned previously the antiquated subdivision, the artisan food production. We spell out specifically the types of production that we're looking for, commemorative plaques, and then the community residential home, pet care services, and microbrewery. For pet care services, we specifically looked at the North American Industry Classification Standard to pull that language out of there. And so the city attorney has reviewed Article 1677 and offered no objections. There are no anticipated budgetary impacts from the ordinance 1677. It reinforces the city's economic vitality and development and community character focus areas of our strategic plan. Staff is recommending that the LPA conduct a hearing on the ordinance 1677 and render a decision, a recommendation of adoption to City Council. Because of advertising, we're trying to take this ordinance to City Council for a first reading, first public hearing on October 15th. And with that, we're available for questions.
Thank you. Are there any questions of staff?
I have a question.
Mr. Ashland?
I just want to make sure I understand. Article 4, Section 4.1, Table 4.1,
Mr. Gaslin, speak into the mic.
where it says add single-family attached townhouse, townhome residential use in R1 or all that other. Is that just saying, were they going there all along and this is just specifying these zones, or are we adding these zones to?
The zones are existing,
Okay.
and they're described by density. So it's low density. One description is low density. The next description is low density, medium density, and then it goes into high density. So we didn't have something in the middle between medium high. When you look at the, and I have my here, when you look at the minimum lot sizes and the way the code is written now, R1B is a medium density. R2 is also medium density, and which is up to 8 units per acre. And then R1BB is a high density, which is up to 15 units per acre. There isn't a spot to allow townhomes, so we tried to place them in a location where it would still meet the medium density category for that residential typology.
So as opposed to creating a separate zone for that?
Right. We just placed that use into the zoning categories which were described in if you look in the prior page of the code, there's a description for each one. We didn't change the description or the densities. We just applied that use type into those existing descriptions.
So basically, we are adding the typology, the townhome, to certain zoning
Right, so-
districts.
I mean, it's possible that, so some neighborhood, you may not be able to find an area that has just single-family homes without also having townhomes in it.
No, we still have all the RCEs, R1AAA, R1AA, R1A, and R1 cannot have townhomes. It's just
But you could have single-family.
R1B, yeah, these are only single family. So we only added the townhome typology to the medium density zoning districts.
All right, thank you.
Are there any other questions?
I have some, I just don't know if it's appropriate now or after we make the motion.
Why don't you go ahead and ask your questions now, and then we may need to incorporate it in the motion.
Okay. I would appreciate the board giving a little leniency here because of my schedule the last few days. I did not have time to ask the staff these questions. But as it comes up tonight, I mean, that Curtis just answered one of mine. One of my big questions, well, I got three related to the microbreweries. One, I think it was in section 411, when it was mentioned in the memo, the staff memo about the prohibited uses, and that we're still leaving standalone bars and cocktail lounges involving alcoholic beverages for consumption on the premises as prohibited, but allowing the microbrewery, do we have a clear definition or standard that distinguishes clearly the difference between these two things, between a bar and a brewery?
Yeah, we do. And we say that microbreweries are not bars, right? Are not standalone bars. So microbreweries, microdistilleries, they have to have a production. So it's a production site with the tasting, with the restaurant. That kind of use we want to stimulate. That's okay. In specific zonings, right? And we already had that discussion, so actually it's already zoning progress in the city. So the council has, when we brought that idea to them, they declared zoning progress, so we haven't had anyone applying, but we could, entertain an application right now for microbreweries and micro wineries and micro distilleries in certain zoning districts. What we want to avoid is the standalone bars, right? That is only allowed right now in Oviedo Park.
Okay, so it's the production is really the standard we'd be looking for, the production aspect, to say that that's the difference.
It's the combination of the only production would not be a microbrewery either for us.
Correct, right. It has to be production and sale.
Yeah.
Basically distribution of some sort. But is there a licensure that's different on the entity side, the business side, that, I mean, I get it in my head, distinguish, say if you come in here and you're going to produce and sell, and you come in here and sell, I'm just selling other manufacturers' stuff, I get that. But is there a difference in licensure that they have to do to kind of separate that too?
They have a limitation to the production that they can have. We did not want to incorporate that in the LDC because that would be an additional task for staff to check production, and we don't have staff to be going to businesses and checking, the annual reports or that, but they have to do that to the state.
Okay.
So there is control from the state too, and it's linked to the license.
I just wanted to see if there was definitely a clear understanding so if somebody does come with an application, they know what to expect and staff knows what to look for. So the second thing was in 410, it mentioned about allowing the food trucks, but only in the industrial zoning if there's a microbrewery there, but not in the other zonings. So is there reasoning behind only allowing it in the industrial and not the other zonings where the brewery would be allowed? Because I'm thinking, I'm not I don't go there a lot, but I go to the breweries. I've been to almost every one that's in the Orlando area, and most of them a lot of them are in commercials and do have food trucks. I'm thinking like Red Cypress is in a commercial strip mall and has food trucks in the back parking lot every day. So, I mean, is there a reason that we're not going to allow that and that we're only going to allow it in the industrial zoning for them to have that?
Yeah, we discussed that. I think we're going to start in a conservative way to understand, what will be, what kind of businesses we are going to attract. But we discussed that, and we did not think that, for instance, in Oviedo Park, having food truck on site, right, would work. So.
But we already do put food trucks in Oviedo in the park.
But it's a park event. It's on the street. Right?
Yeah.
We would not be able to allow that for businesses, right, to use the right-of-way on a regular basis, right? So we thought it was more of an industrial, character, but...
I mean, I guess I just question that because, I mean, again, speaking from experience and going to these places that have it, I mean, a lot of them, they don't have food. I mean, that's part of the whole microbrewery versus restaurant ideal. A BJ's Brew House that brews their own stuff, but they're a restaurant. But a microbrewery generally won't have it. So unless they're next to a food source, something, like when you look at Hourglass over in Longwood, they have, Waco's Tacos connected to them. So they have an establishment they can walk into. But someplace that Red Cypress that didn't have that, they have the food truck. So I don't want to get limiting here on microbreweries coming in by telling them, well, unless you're in the industrial zone, the food truck's out of the question, because then they may not come. I mean, they may be like, well, that's part of the, I don't know, mystique, but part of the appeal of it is having that capability of having that rotating food. every night. So-
I'm a little confused. Are you concerned that we're not allowing the food trucks or that we are allowing the food trucks?
No, I'm concerned that we're not allowing the
not
food
allowing.
trucks in other zonings other than the industrial, that we would not allow it in Oviedo in the Park, a C2. We're saying microbreweries can be in all these other zones, but we're saying the food truck's only in industrial. So I'm concerned by restricting it that tightly that we have breweries that will not come because of that.
Well, we looked at the presentation by the planning agency, last year's planning conference, and the trend is to allow, because as you say, food, these types of micro businesses don't actually offer food on site. So some of the locations that we looked at allowed people to bring in their own foods from other locations, but they didn't actually serve food on site. The zoning districts in which, other than I-1, I-2, allow restaurants in those locations. I-1 does not, and I-2 does not allow restaurants of any kind. So to allow food trucks would allow for that rotation of food types, because the other zoning districts where the micro businesses are proposed to be located do allow restaurants.
Right. Yeah, like I said, it's just a concern I have that if we have a microbrewery that comes into a commercial or the downtown district, but we're not allowing them to have a food truck, it's kind of restrictive. Because yes, you can bring food in, but again, if the food's not easily close by, that can change some of the consumer perspectives. It's like, I mean, part of the appeal is going in and knowing I can walk out the back door and grab the food truck, place my order, go back in, enjoy my drink until it's ready, and then come back and get it. And we're saying only in an industrial area where, I mean, now you're isolated out there. So, because we only have, where's our industrial areas in town? I mean, it's very limited as it is. So, I don't know. Like I said, that's a concern I have there, is that one. And so then going to the parking, again with the microbreweries, with restaurants, we have it by square foot. But for the microbreweries, we're putting it by spaces by number of seats. 1 space per 4 seats, 1 space per 2 employees at the highest shift. So, again, I'm just trying to get an understanding of why we're doing that so different than all the other retail, service stations, restaurants, shopping center are all by square footage, but we're doing that one by seats in the building. Most microbreweries I've been to does have seating, but some of them do just have large standing areas and not seats. So I'm wondering if by saying 1 space per 4 seats, and you've got a brewery that designs it more as a standing type of area, then our parking standards are going to be so low that they wouldn't have enough parking spaces to cover that site. So I'm just kind of getting the understanding of why we're doing that so different than the other ones in our table.
Mr. Minton, I had questions about the parking for microbreweries as well, and staff has a list of other municipalities that they've looked at. Do you want to go over some of that and explain how you came up with this?
Certainly. So we looked at other cities that had at least 3 microbreweries in the city currently, and we also looked at them by population. So, for example, and I have this here that I can pass out to everyone. Some comparable jurisdictions, Gainesville, 136,000 population. They have 3 microbreweries now, and their parking standard is 3 spaces, plus 1 per 3 seats, and bicycle parking is 10% of the required car spaces. The city of Jacksonville Beach is 23,000 population, 4 breweries, and 1 space per 100, which is comparable to our restaurant standard. The city of Tallahassee, 191,000, 4 breweries, 1 space per 100, up to 6,000 square feet, and 1 space per 75 square feet gross floor area. The city of Fort Myers, the city of, did I say Bradenton? City of Bradenton, 56,000 square feet. So population that's probably closest to us. 3 breweries, and all they require is 1 space per 3 seats. Fort Myers, 77,000 population, 3 breweries, 1 space per 3 seats. Jacksonville itself, 892,000 population, 10 breweries, 1 space per 4 seats, plus 1 per employee on the peak shift and then one bicycle space per every 5,000 square feet with a minimum of 2. Orlando, its population is 277,000. They have 5 breweries, and their standard is 5 spaces per 1,000 square feet, plus 1.5 spaces per 1,000 square feet of manufacturing and production area. The max is 10 per 1,000 square feet. And then Sarasota is like our restaurant, 1 per 100,000, and their population is 57,000 square feet, persons. So these other municipalities are doing it based on seats as well, so that's why we chose to go based on seats. And they're kind of all over the place, and so we tried to pick one that's close to our restaurant standard, but not as restrictive as our restaurant standard. And the goal is to have microbreweries in locations that are more conducive to multi-modes, whether, a percentage of the population attending are driving there, they're walking there, they're biking there. With the onset of the more alternative modes, they could be lifting there, they could be carpooling there, so that we create almost an even keel of the potential ways that people could get there. So these are the other cities that we looked at.
And I think the idea is also because it's a different layout than a restaurant, right? So restaurant square footage would give, I think a better reflection of the space. And I think microbrewers can have bars, so it can be more,
Well, there's also, I can understand maybe the square footage being a problem too,
Yeah.
because their production space, you may have 5,000 square feet and 2,000 of them may be production space where you don't need parking. So, but I guess my question would be, if we go with seats, do we need to clearly define permanent versus possible? Because again, when you look at a place like Red Cypress, they have the back production area they can reserve out, like just kind of like what we have with the Lido in the Park, they can reserve out, but the seats are not permanent. They're just tables and chairs they bring out. Now, that's going to increase the number of cars that need to be there at the time they're utilizing that, but they don't always utilize that. So, I mean, I guess that's my perspective when I look at seats, is that I could go there on any given day and the number of seats is different, depending on what kind of layout they have for that day, what kind of special event they have. So,
well, they are in a shopping center, right? They are in a shopping center.
correct.
So
And
they
they're in
can
a shopping center.
probably,
Yeah, they're sharing. I mean,
Yeah,
so it
share.
gets tight when they do have the big events. But it makes sense why I see now why we did with the seats. But I'm just curious if we do need to make that designation, or maybe switch to occupancy, and say 1 per number of occupants instead of seats. That way, no matter what arrangement they have, their total fire code capacity could be what we base the parking on. I mean, maybe just another idea out there.
I think also the idea of the parking is that we require the minimum parking, right? I mean, the business will, to be successful, they would have to provide enough parking, right? So if they,
Yeah, but
if
we-
they are
we
so
know like some of the
successful,
businesses go to the men.
but that's the thing, we have to provide, we don't want to also make in a way that small microbreweries cannot afford to come to the city because we are requesting so much parking,
Right.
right? That will not be utilized. So it's always that balance of, what exactly to request. Most of I think the places that we have a lot of shopping centers, right? Shopping malls, so they could use shared parking depending on the hours,
Right,
right?
the ones that are,
So-
the ones that are in the commercial area is true.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm thinking about some of the ones that are in industrial zonings, like there's, not 1010, but there's one over in Winter Park that's in basically an old garage. So it's in a street where it's like, a sprinkler company, garage, and it's an old one. So it's in its ISO-owned building. Now, the parking there is very limited because it was originally a garage, so nobody just came and parked and hung out for 5 or 6 hours. But that's what I'm thinking is when you, and I've been in that place where it is a lot of standing type of seating. Even though they have a bar, they don't have seats at the bar. So again, I'm looking at that per seats. If we went by that minimum, there's like almost no parking in that building. So I just wanted to throw that out there, that that's just, by defining it differently than all the rest, I'm just wondering if we need to be careful with how we're defining seats in that case. So,
It's a good
yeah.
point. I mean, the standing, right? If you have standing tables, right?
Right. Right.
and you don't have seats, I mean, would we count that, right, as possible seats? I think we could, right?
The thing that we would just need to double check is the fire code and the building code have different occupancy rates. So we'd have to pick one or the other, or because the fire code, as I understand it, it's 1 per 15 square feet. The building code is 1 per 50 square feet. So do we use the more restrictive one at 1 per 15 per the fire code? And if that's the case, we just have to see if that makes sense. The other thing too is Public Works for benching or seating. They actually, and same thing with the fire department. They have for a bench seat, for example, instead of chairs, it's by linear foot of bench space. So maybe it could be, what's the word? Circumference of the tables. Maybe it could be if you have a countertop table like this, that could be 4 seats because 4 people could stand there. You know, that kind of thing. We could certainly look at that.
I appreciate
Throw something
that.
in there.
Go ahead, Mr. Gash.
With what Mr. Minton is saying. Other counties and towns also use with seats, so they had so many spaces per patron use area. So if there are situations where it's a bar and no seats, then it's still patron use area.
I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time hearing you.
Okay. Other counties and whatnot, in restaurants, not only do they just use so many so many parking spaces per seat, but they also include so many spaces per patron use area. So if you have whatever size room, if it's a long bar and no seats, you still have patron use area that you'll have to apply parking spaces to. Just tossing that in there.
You know, Teresa, as I was talking to you earlier about this, to have 1 space per 4 seats, most folks I know, when they go out, there aren't 4 people in one car. You're meeting another couple, you're meeting other people there, and so there's more cars than 1 per 4 people. And I understand about hoping it's in the downtown area, so there's other ways, other means of transportation. With the difficulties that we're seeing already with parking in downtown, this looks like way too little parking for a microbrewery to me. I would be happy if you doubled it. I know they may not, the businesses may not.
Well, we had included, actually, in her research, Anat included some parking spaces for the production area as well. And we're talking to Brian. Brian asked us to reduce it, to remove, because he thought it was too much. So it's really trying to find the balance. I know that one microbrewery that was looking for to come to Oviedo on the Park, they were interested in getting in being close to our parking lot. So they were going to provide, their own parking, spaces based on our requirement, but they wanted to have the additional, parking next to them just to sell the convenience, right? So I think it will depend on situations. I was mentioning to the chairperson before that because it's a microbrewery, so my thinking was that maybe people will carpool more because it's a drinking, it's not a restaurant, so people will go there to drink, and maybe people will do more carpooling, right? And maybe the younger folks will do more of a group, So it's really an average, right? So we have to the standard is really trying to get the average. We use other cities as a benchmark because they already have, that use, in place, so we kind of use theirs, but I mean, it's really this point is really trying to guess what is the right balance.
Perhaps Mr. Groot can tell us if we leave the wording at 1 space per 4 seats, does that allow us the flexibility to require more when it's the patron usage areas and there aren't actual seats?
No.
Then perhaps we need to change the wording somehow or other so that we encompass both seats and standing room.
No, not right now.
If you want to do that, I think what you'd recommend is that you add to the, well, assuming you leave this one space per 4 seats, plus whatever per patron use area, and also recommend that that term be defined, which is not right now. So that, I think that'd be your recommendation if that's where I see you all going.
So if we stay with the one space per 4 seats, then perhaps also say an additional one space per 4 patron use areas? Is that how?
Per square feet.
Per
So
square
many
feet.
spaces more like, so many spaces per square foot of patron use area, excluding seating. So you're not adding to the seating. Seating's already
So
there.
you're not counting it twice.
Maybe
Well,
like one
the fire code is
So you're-
space per 75 square feet.
So you're suggesting the patron use area is the area where people actually consume the beverage that's being made. So if you did it by square foot of the patron use area, would you be able to include the tables without having to specify seats?
I don't know if you can. I know that that's not the way they do it.
Okay.
You know, I'm using Orange County as an example.
I don't think your mic's working very well.
That's working.
I think it's one bar is broken, but the mic works fine.
So on the list of cities that you read, which one of them, can you go over some of them that go by square foot?
Yes, ma'am. The city of Boca Raton, 96,000 population, 3 breweries, 1 per 35 square feet gross floor area, excluding food and drink prep areas, storage areas, and other areas not directly utilized by the public, plus 1 per 2 linear foot of the bar. See, and then the other one, Jacksonville Beach, population of 23,000. They have 4 breweries, 1 space per 100 square feet. Orlando has 5 breweries, 5 spaces per 1,000 square feet of gross floor area minimum, plus 1.5 spaces per 1,000 square feet of manufacturing or production area, with a max of 10 per 1,000 square feet gross floor area. Pensacola is 1 per 75 square feet, which is almost double what Boca Raton has at 135 square feet. Sarasota is 1 per 100. St. Petersburg is 1 per 1,000 square feet in a traditional or downtown area, and 1 per 500 square feet in suburban areas. That is very much close to our manufacturing standard, so there's very few seats. And Tallahassee, 1 space per 100 square feet gross area with a max up to 6,000 square feet, plus 1 per every 75 square feet after that.
So it sounds like there were several that were 1 per 100 square feet.
There were 2.
Okay.
Jacksonville Beach is 1 per 100, and Sarasota is 1 per 100. I'm sorry, and Tallahassee is 1 per 100.
So 3 of them.
Mm-hmm.
I was just told, and maybe you already know, that the fire code, I was saying how much square footage is Teresa occupying, but I was told that the fire code, it gives, 15 square foot per person? 6 times 15 is 90, so you're right around 100. So it seems like 6 people for 100 square feet is what it seems to be drifting to, at least those codes, right?
Yeah, if my memory serves me, and I can check with the fire marshal in some of the pre-app meetings that we sat in, is 1 person is 15 square feet for life safety plans.
So if that's the case, then maybe we would need 1.5 parking spaces per 100. If there's 6 I just don't think 1 per 4 seats is enough. given
So
the
it's
parking
actually
issues we have already.
1.5 spaces per 100 is more, requires more parking spaces than our restaurant standard.
More than our restaurants?
We
What
have
do the restaurants require?
1 per 100.
I'm sorry?
1 per 100.
100.
Right, yeah, the restaurants are 1 per 100, but
But restaurants
if you
have-
think about it, I mean...
You're
people
not
that are-
limiting to seats, so you get circulation, you get additional, right?
But you also, but if you look at patron usage a lot, if you look at like a microbrewery, people are going to spend longer there than they probably do at a restaurant. So you're not going to have as much turnover coming in and out as you go there. So, you might get into a parking space, and that person's going to be sitting in that parking space for 4 or 5 hours, and another person trying to come up. Whereas a restaurant's like more of a constant turnover, it's so... I mean,
Wow,
I've
4 or 5 hours.
I've already been on the record before. I've already been on the record before.
That is intense, right?
A football game goes 4 hours, so if you
I
want to
don't
go to the
think
brewery
your
and watch
car's
the
going to
game...
stay in the parking spot if it's 4 or 5 hours longer than overnight. But it goes to your point.
Yeah,
Because
but-
it's not leaving at all then.
Right,
If
I
you're
mean...
drinking for 4 or 5 hours, you do need to Uber.
Yeah. Well, that's what we're saying. So you may need more spots for cars that have...
I sometimes feel like a broken record because I've said it before. I think that our restaurant parking is too lenient because we do have places that are just overpacked. That the number of cars and parking spaces is not matching what the seating capacity is in the restaurant. So, I mean, I fear that if the restaurant's already 1 per 100 and we've already seen cases where that's not enough, and we go 1 per 100, we may still see cases that are just not enough. I have to agree with Ms. Moore that I think we need more spaces. I mean, I think that maybe 1.5 per 100 is the right way to go.
I hear your concern. I actually am happy to see that it's a streamlined parking scenario and less parking. I agree with the city on this. I think it's a good thing. I think our society is changing with the younger people, with the millennials and people my age. And, I think more people are apt to walk. I agree with it. I think it's a good thing. I actually appreciate when I go to a parking lot and it's completely full versus a parking lot that's empty. I feel like it's overplanned and too much asphalt. It was poorly designed or poor use. It was all one car, one person going to a spot. I think this is forward thinking, and it's us becoming a larger city. So I think
The only zoning district, like a regular standard zoning district that the use is allowed is C2. So, and typically they're in shopping centers, and there's opportunity to share parking spaces. They can always provide satellite parking spaces. The majority of the zoning districts that is allowed is in the downtown mixed-use district, where the goal is to create more compatible, more pedestrian scale, walkable environments. So that's also something for the board to consider.
And that's fine for the folks who live in the downtown area, but still so much of Oviedo drives. So many of us don't work in Oviedo. We're driving out every day and coming back every afternoon. So we're in our cars when we're stopping to have a drink on the way home. So many of us are still in cars. That I just think we have to have more parking than 1 per 4.
Plus, there's also the nuisance parking element. If you don't have enough spaces, somebody might take other businesses' parking spaces, and it may affect negatively a business. We want to encourage people not to, waste space, but at the same time, if you don't have enough parking, like we see at Outback Steakhouse sometimes, other businesses can be affected, and people park wherever their cars fit. And sometimes it's not where we want them to park. Especially, we've seen this with festivals on Oviedo on the Park, where in some of these neighborhoods, people who live there, people are parking in their apartment complexes and in their spots, and people are complaining there's nowhere to park, and then we have to deal with tow trucks coming in and out. So I think I agree with the panel on this one.
Well, let me ask staff this question. Can we set the requirements by zoning district? In other words, can we have a different requirement depending on which zoning district it's located in?
Yeah, we can.
Sure, any rational basis, yes.
I mean, so for instance, talking about the downtown area where you may have more pedestrian traffic, can we say, well, we don't need as many spaces there, so maybe have a 1 per 4, but in an area that's in a different zoning, either an I or a C1, it's not part of a shopping center or part of a small strip area, we could have a need for more parking spaces. I'm thinking like the mall. I mean, the one that's going in right now is the one at the mall. And
And
who's
that's-
going to ride their bike or walk to the mall? I mean, it's only the...
Well,
Yeah.
parking is not an issue in the mall, unfortunately, right?
Yes, but what I'm saying is, isolated from the rest of the mall, I'm just saying that if that location is definitely not pedestrian-friendly or bicycle-friendly, so that's a spot where people are going to have to drive to get to, versus Oviedo on the Park, in that zoning, we might not need as many spaces because of the way that is set up. So maybe that's the solution here, is to maybe create a different requirement based on the zone. Now, what that requirement is per zone, I mean, that might take a while here, but, I mean, maybe that's something that needs to be tabled at this point to investigate and not send to council yet, because we may need to research on and clarify on what's appropriate for each zone, if that's the way we want to go.
I like that suggestion better than just doing a blanket one of 1.5 per 100.
So they could,
While they're talking, can I ask a couple quick questions?
Yes. Mr. Pollack?
Thank you.
Yeah, totally.
On this parking issue, and
recommended changes.
I know we're way, way early, but I know that there's been discussion on council with possibly expanding the golf cart zoning. And I know we're still doing studies on whether or not that's even allowable, and I know the police department has to get back to us and all that. Would it be a waste of time to include the potential for parking spaces for people to put golf carts if Oviedo on the Park becomes a golf cart friendly area? I mean, we'd have to change the code again at that point. Or if we're looking at parking now, can we include a certain amount of spaces if, how does that work?
Good question,
You talking about golf carts?
Well, we're trying. I want them, but they're studying whether or not it's feasible, because there's certain requirements on speed limits, and there's a lot of stuff that has to be discussed whether or not it can be expanded. But anyway, that being said, if we're changing this code and we're talking about parking in these districts, I wonder if we don't also put in a part for potential golf cart parking.
Well, whatever we do is a minimum requirement, right?
Right.
So we would not be able to create a minimum requirement for golf carts, parking spaces, if we don't allow them.
They would just take car spaces, essentially, right?
At this point, I would imagine they would occupy a parking space, right? But we can change the code if that is allowed, right? And that becomes substantial to, because everything we do have an impact on developers, right? They have to provide now, a specific, parking space for golf cart that a car cannot use, right?
Yeah, so we shouldn't put the golf cart before the horse.
Yeah, I think that's too early.
I just have one more quick question before we back to the parking thing, and then I'm done. With what Tommy was saying about the food trucks and being restricted to the industrial areas, so I understand that there's the future planning for places like Oviedo on the Park. There is, we're trying to attract like a tiny food stall area, and with the microbreweries in there. And I know we also don't want to compete too much with the businesses that are already there. Is the food truck restrictions to these industrial areas an effort to avoid putting additional competition on vendors we're trying to attract to certain zoning?
No, I think it was less of that and how to incorporate them in a parking lot, right? Because where would we put the truck? I mean, we are not talking about using the street, the right-of-way, right? So it would have to be on site.
Right.
So we thought that would be too complicated, right? To incorporate them in the downtown environment or in a shopping center environment. You have to occupy parking spaces, right? To allow them. In industrial area, it's more relaxed.
Or closed streets, like Oviedo on the Park.
Well, but on a regular basis,
No, that's what I mean.
yeah, we would not be able to allow that, right? So,
Well, in the case of Red Cypress, they put theirs in the back. I mean, they don't use the right-of-way in the front. It's in the loading alleyway zone, whatever you want to call it, in the back. Now, they do have other parking spaces back there as well, but they're not using a space, that's visible or, like you said, in the right-of-way or taking parking spaces away from the establishment. So it'd be, akin to putting, the redo of the Albertsons, putting it in the back, and back there towards the loading zone where you wouldn't see it.
Could we have it if space allows, or you can get maybe a special permit if the space allows it, where we can take a closer look at? I mean, would that be too complicated? So if a microbrewery is in a place where it would work to have a food truck, can we put something in the code that says if you have the space for it, you can get it? I mean, I don't know if they would have to come to LPA for permission, but maybe the city can determine based on space. I don't know. I'm just trying to come up with a way to accommodate those kind of businesses who may want food to assist in building their business in a way that, you're right, doesn't have to take up 7 parking spots. We're already talking about parking spot issues.
I mean, we do have other code in here that does say, C1 or C2 by special exemption, like we did with the warehouse one. So I don't know why we couldn't do something like that to say, or in C1 OC downtown by special exception, and then, let an application come through and say, is it feasible in this location or not? I just don't like the idea of just
You can do
handing it
that.
all together.
Yeah, you can recommend that. You can take to council with your, I mean, you can recommend different, tweaks to our proposal, right?
Yeah, used by right and industrial, special exception, and other
In
zoning.
all the other uses, or zoning districts.
And that way you deal with the logistics, because if you're blocking the back and there's fire issues, the answer is no. If you close the street, it's all case by case then.
Right.
And that's all the
That's
questions
a
I had. Thank you for the time. And I apologize for not meeting with you ahead of time to talk to you about this. I've also had a very crazy week. So I'm making more of an effort to come and see you guys before meetings, before I ask ridiculous questions.
That's okay.
I apologize.
So Lonnie, did you guys come up with a good example of how we could word?
Well, the last one's easy. I'm not sure you came to any. What about parking?
The parking in different zones, for different zones.
Well, we were just talking over here, Teresa, and you do have a meeting on October 2nd?
Here,
Yeah.
yeah.
So we could, to me, it's easy to do this, what we just talked about, food trucks, to make it a special exception in other zoning districts. The parking, I think, is a little more technical. You might want to defer that and rehear this again at your next meeting, and we could come up with some proposals then, I think, don't you?
So if we continued this
Yes,
item to
that's what I
our
was thinking.
next meeting,
And we could come up with some specific proposals on parking. Options.
Would that interfere too much with your schedule when you wanted to have it at council?
No, because we are going to take this to City Council on October 15th.
Yeah, it's perfect.
So October 1st would be when we would have to present our package, but we can update the memo on October 3rd.
I just have a process question for Lonnie. Do we need to re-advertise the October 2nd then for?
No,
for
just
this again?
continue this tonight. If
Okay,
you just
that's fine.
continue this till your next meeting, we'll be in great shape.
Right, because the ad for the October
we're
15th
good.
one will have
We're
to
good.
do
Just-
before that meeting.
Just don't take any actions except to continue.
so if we have consensus, then we want staff to look at wording for the parking for the microbreweries in different zoning districts,
Or other options, right?
or other options to accomplish providing for more parking, and also possibly allowing food trucks at the microbreweries
By special exception.
by special exception.
Permit.
Do we have consensus for
Use
that?
by right and industrial and special exception. Okay.
Okay. So then, do we have,
Okay, so I'm clear, are we continuing in the entire
Yeah.
ordinance?
Yes.
Yes.
To make those changes? Okay.
yes. So do we have a motion to continue?
I so moved a motion to continue ordinance, what is it, 1677 to our October 2nd meeting.
Second.
Thank you. Is, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries.
We didn't
Thank
need
you.
to state why we were continuing in the motion, right? Because we told them orally, I guess.
We don't have to. Okay, the next item is discussion items, the training presentation.
This will be very brief. I promise. There's a short video I'd like you to watch. Tonight we're going to talk briefly about content regulation and also about how a little thing can become a big deal in terms of going to the U.S. Supreme Court. We're finding that out right now, just in the nomination process. But this story talks about a case. This will be about, 4 minutes, I think?
Just narrated by you. Oh.
Pastor Clyde Reed is celebrating today's Supreme Court decision.
I say I never dreamed my small church signs would be a topic for the U.S. Supreme Court.
Because it wasn't just about them. It was about all of us. Because today it's the pastor's and the church's speech, and tomorrow it could be yours.
Today's High Court decision affirms that religious speech is protected under the First Amendment and cannot be treated as inferior to other speech. In 2005, the town of Gilbert twice cited Pastor Reed for violating its sign code, which subjected him to possible fines and even jail time. The issue at stake? Small signs Reed placed inviting the community to Sunday morning church services. Gilbert's sign code restricted the church signs to a maximum of only 6 square feet. Other signs in Gilbert could be as large as 80 square feet. Reed's sign could only be up for 12 hours, mostly at night. Other signs were not subject to the same time limits.
The church, as the little guy in this David and Goliath battle, if you will, was just trying to invite people to its Sunday services. But yet it would have to go out in the dark of night on Saturday and put up its few signs, and then as soon as church was over, it would have to go out and collect those signs before it received another notice from the town that would entail possible jail time and substantial fines.
Meanwhile, political signs can stay up for 5 months, and ideological signs indefinitely. Alliance Defending Freedom filed suit against the city in March of 2007 on behalf of Good News Community Church and Pastor Reed. Today's unanimous decision ends more than 8 years of litigation.
This restriction was, in our opinion, so clearly unconstitutional that 9 Supreme Court justices agreed, and I think that speaks for itself.
That which we couldn't do freely before, we can now, and we're looking for growth. And I can't help but think the vast majority of Americans will be very encouraged by this decision.
Okay, you see a little Gilbert, Arizona, little church signs, and it ended up at the U.S. Supreme Court. That story was a little bit misleading because it said unanimous decision. That's true, except it was unanimous in the result, not the reason. And so you have to read all these concurring opinions to see what the reason was, and they didn't agree. Surprise, surprise. But real quickly, just an aside, David Cortman, the attorney you saw, when Seminole County, and some of y'all remember and some of y'all won't, when Seminole County was in the battle with Club Wana and Circus, the adult entertainment, and we did our ordinance, which has been a model throughout the nation, actually. It was me, Marianne Klein from the Sheriff's Office, Joe Cocciarella from the Orange County State Attorney's Office, and David Cortman. He was with the American Family Association or something like that, and they volunteered his time. So he was one of the 4 people that worked on the Seminole County Adult Entertainment Code, which this city has pretty much adopted in total. But little case, and that's one thing I'm going to talk about at the next meeting too, is how these little scenarios end up at the U.S. Supreme Court. The last thing I want to mention, the issue in that case was content regulation. You know, because if you had to read the sign to figure out whether it was legal or not. And whenever you have to read the sign to figure out if it's legal, it's content regulation. Okay? Now, I want to just go over a couple of things that happened after that case. Because, as you know, cases are used for precedent, right? So that case was used in striking down a panhandling ordinance. Why? Because panhandling ordinances often say you can't ask for money. I can ask for your vote. I can ask you to buy Boy Scout popcorn or Girl Scout cookies. I can ask you to be saved and go to heaven, but I can't ask you for money. So the ordinance was stricken because of, on the basis of the Gilbert decision. Election signs were stricken because how can you limit the length of a sign if by making election signs only eligible to be in place for so many days? Once again, McDonald's signs don't have to be taken down after 60 days. So why does vote for Minton have to be taken down after 60 days? So that ordinance was stricken down. Robocalling. South Carolina tried to regulate robocalling, but there were certain exemptions, and the exemptions made the statute content regulation. So that statute was stricken. That Gilbert case was used to strike down a law that says you can't take photos of your ballot. Okay? Because people would take pictures of their ballot and say, look how I voted. Be like me. Right. You know. And that statute was stricken on the basis of Gilbert because that regulated the content of the photo that you could take and display. Solicitors. If you exempt certain solicitors, Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts, that say somebody else can't sell, you're saying, you're saying that you can't sell. Can't sell because of what you're asking. If I ask you to buy my Girl Scout cookies, it's okay. If I ask you to buy my smoking tobacco or whatever, that's probably illegal anyway. That's illegal. And the last one, this is the most interesting to me. That Gilbert case was used to strike down, well, actually not strike down, to allow a claim against a public official, and I forgot what state it was. Oh, Pennsylvania. When the public official emailed a citizen and said, quote, please never contact me, the Board of Supervisors, or the township employees directly. Do not call me at work, email me at work, or speak to me in public or private, unquote. And the person sued saying, you're discriminating against me because you're saying that I can't talk to you. And that case was used to allow the claim of the citizen against a public official who had said don't contact me. So that little case about a little sign in Little Gilbert, Arizona, ended up at the U.S. Supreme Court and is still being used to strike down other codes and ordinances and statutes throughout the nation. Anyway, that's the, yes.
Since you brought up ordinances or codes with the political yard signs, are HOAs allowed to restrict those in neighborhoods?
It depends upon your covenants and restrictions, I suppose.
Well, I mean, that's my question, I guess, do HOAs have the legal authority to restrict them?
I'm not an HOA lawyer, but the only thing I know that the legislature has stepped in and said you can't restrict is American flags, the display of the American flag. But I think other than that, it's up to the HOA. I have a daughter who's head of terrorism mitigation and a genius, and we were talking, what your typical daughter and father talk about Sunday, First Amendment, right? And she, as bright as she is, she said, they can't do that, Daddy. I said, it's not government. She said, oh, yeah, that's right. You overlook that sometimes. We all do. The First Amendment applies to government saying, you can't do this. If I say, you're in my house, don't talk like that, if you do, get out, I can do that. You don't have a First Amendment right in my house. Maybe you don't have one in Publix either. Maybe you don't have one in the Sublime subdivision. Depends upon your covenant restrictions. But the legislature did say that you can't prohibit display of the American flag.
Satellite dishes.
What's that?
Satellite dishes. HOAs can't restrict satellite dishes.
Well, that's true, too. The federal government got involved in that. See, sometimes you can figure out who has good lobbyists, can't you? Anyway, that's all I have. Hope that's interesting a little bit.
Thank you, Lonnie. Are there any other discussion items we need to talk about? Okay, our future meeting dates are October 2nd, October 16th. If there's nothing else, do we have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Thank you. Have a second? Second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? We stand adjourned.